All right, I'm going to get started with the mechanics for the first-person snowball fight. We're going to keep this project fairly simple in terms of the mechanics and focus on gameplay and level of refinement in terms of packaging this product. So just a quick tour of what I have so far. I have a real simple kind of sandbox level. There's no details in the scene yet. We're going to focus on art assets a little bit later. But for now, the goal is just to get the core mechanic up and running. So I have a simple scene. I have a couple of targets inside my scene. I just have a snowman and a couple of cubes that have rigid bodies assigned to them. Okay, so I have some cubes in the environment, and I just created a couple of cubes, added a component physics rigid body to them. So we have this element inside the scene that we can kind of throw snowballs at and knock over. Okay, so I'm going to focus on the core concept or the core mechanic of firing a snowball. Okay, so I have a first-person controller already inside my scene. That's what I'm using to walk around this environment. And I'm going to modify that just a little bit so that we have a spawn point that we can start launching our projectiles. Okay, so I just noticed Playmaker was not set up in my interface. So I'm going to set that up really quickly. I prefer to take the Playmaker editor and nest that to the right of my project panel. And then I also like to have the Actions browser off to the right. So I'm going to go to Editor, Windows, Action Browser, and then of course any other windows you feel compelled to have open. So that's going to be my default layout. I like to leave, at least when I'm working on a Mac, I like to leave part of the desktop available so that I can bring information in simply by dragging and dropping and manage that content directly inside the project folder. So I want to set up a really simple projectile mechanic, and the way that I'll do that is my preference is to just have a simple object inside the scene that's acting as my projectile. So I'm going to create a 3D game object. I'm going to start with a sphere. I'll put this sphere a little bit closer. Sphere. I'm going to put that a little bit closer to my first-person controller. So I'm going to make sure that that's up. That's up. There it is. And out. I'll refine the size of it here a little bit later. But if I want to get this sphere to line up exactly with the first-person controller, I'll just temporarily throw that in my first-person controller. I'm going to zero out the coordinate system, and that means that it's centered inside my first-person controller, and I'll just pull that back out. So this is going to be my snowball object. And my snowball object is going to need a rigid body, right? Because I'm going to fling it. I'm going to throw it with force. And I'm going to allow the physics engine to manage the interaction, the hit detection of this. So the first thing that I want to do is I want to send this snowball in the direction of Z with some force. Okay, I'm going to take the mass of the snowball down a bit. I can bump this up a little bit later. But I think I'm going to take it down to about 0.5. Everything else I'll let default. So I'm going to add a state machine, and I'll start in state 1 with a real simple physics add force. And I want to add force in the direction of Z. I'll probably want to use a variable a little bit later because I want to kind of control the power with which I fling this. But for now, I'll just get started with... I'll probably get started pretty high. Well, I'll start with like 50 and see what that gives me. I'm not going to do this every frame, and I don't want to send this in the world space, right? Because I want it to be relative to the direction that the snowball will be pointing. So I'm going to hit the play button and see what we get. Okay, not much of anything. It just kind of falls to the ground. And that's because we're not sending this every frame. In fact, we don't want to do that because if we did, then this thing would just kind of keep moving. It's going to blast off into space and just ricochet and do some really strange things. So what I want to do is I want to get this force high enough to where it flings the snowball. Got a long way to go. Okay, now this is where I could start playing around with the mass. I don't want the snowball to be too heavy, so before I continue to crank up the mass, let's see, I got lost here. Let me just zoom out, grab something here. All turned around here. Okay, so we'll give that a shot. Hit the play button. Okay, so that wasn't too bad. It started heading in the direction that I want. But I have a feeling that once this mass is too low, I'm not going to be able to interact too much with the physics. So I'm just going to bump this up. I'll try to send this up to about 1,000 for now. Now, if I add too much force to this, you can see there that I can barely see the sphere, in fact. So I have to take that back down. So I'm just going to tinker with this a little bit and kind of get that dialed in. That's a little bit closer to what I want. Okay, so every time I hit the space bar or the mouse fire, I want to be able to fling a snowball. Now, I arrived at this setting. I am going to send it up along the y-axis just a little bit to kind of get it to arc just a bit. So maybe I'll set that to 50 and see how that works. That's a little better. That's exactly what I'm looking for. Now again, I'll come back and kind of dial this in a little bit later. Maybe I'll slow this thing down with some drag, but I'll dial in the mechanics and dial in the way that this reacts during gameplay. But for now, I just want to get that first-person mechanism up and running. So the first thing I'm going to do now that I have my snowball is I'm going to make sure that my first-person controller is selected. I'm going to move the snowball off to the side just a little bit so I can see a little bit more clearly what's going on here. And I'm going to zoom in on my first-person controller. Now, I want a spawn point inside my first-person controller, but I also don't want it inside the capsule collider here. Okay, so I'm just going to create an empty game object, and this is going to be my I'll call this shoot spawn, and I'll throw this in the first-person controller. And I'll make sure everything's zeroed out. It looks like it's in a good position. And now I'm just going to move it off to the side, kind of out in front of my first-person controller. I'm just clicking back and forth to make sure that this is not going to interfere with the collider on my first-person controller, and that looks pretty good. Okay, so on my first-person controller, I could do this, in a number of different places, but I'm going to get started just with this attached to the first-person controller. I'm going to start with my shooting mechanic. Okay, so I'm going to add a state machine. It's best practice at this point to make sure that we're naming our FSMs. So I'll call this shooting mechanic. Okay, and on my state, this will be my idle state. And I'll simply be listening for some user input. And on user input, probably going to do this with the get mouse down. So I'm listening for a left mouse click, and once I get the left mouse click, I'm going to create an event called fire. And I'll fire off the fire event, and I'll add fire, and wire that over to my state, which I'll call throw snowball. Not through snowball. Let's try that again. Throw snowball. There we go. Okay. And on throw snowball, this is where I want to start kind of flinging my snowballs. So I'm going to spawn or create a game object, but I'm temporarily going to use the snowball that's inside the scene rather than a prefab, but I'll wire up the prefab a little bit later. Okay, and for all the reasons that we talked about in Game Design 1 and Game Design 2, we definitely want to use prefabs in this situation. Okay, so let's see, I'm going to create a game object. The game object that I'm going to create, we'll just borrow this snowball. I got a typo in there. I'll fix that later. And the spawn point that I'm going to use is my shoot spawn. Okay, everything else I'm going to let default. I should be able to throw one snowball at this point when I hit the mouse. There we go. But I can't relaunch, and that's because I'm stuck in the throw snowball state. Okay, so I could solve this a number of different ways. I could listen for the mouse up. I'm going to do a simple wait command. So I'll go in time, we'll do a wait, and for now I'm going to wait for 0.5 seconds. And I'll make a reset event. And after a half a second, we'll fire off the reset, which will allow us to throw another snowball. Now later we're gonna add to this so that we can create different kinds of mechanics. So I can point up in the air. Right now, pointing up in the air is not doing exactly what I want. Okay, so as I rotate around, okay, I'm not able to move my spawn point, and that's probably because I probably should have put my shoot spawn actually inside my first person controller or my first person character instead of my FPS controller. So I'll tinker with that because, again, my goal, and I'll just switch out of the game view here for a moment, and I'll look at the first person controller. My goal here is that when I'm looking around, okay, my camera's shifting, I really want that that snowball to mimic the direction that I'm pointing. Okay, so I'll tinker with that offline and try to get that worked out. But take some time, take the scene that you created in the previous exercise and start to populate this with some simple obstacles, some simple targets that we can start flinging snowballs at. And we'll take a closer look at extending the mechanics in the next presentation.